Yes. Okay, shall we start? Everybody ready? Yes. Okay. Welcome and thank you for watching this discussion. My name is Gert-Jan van het Land, and we are meeting here because we could not have a discussion in a lecture hall of the University of Amsterdam. We were invited there for a discussion with Professor Michael Richardson on my left side, from Leiden University, Jerry Coyne from Chicago on my right side, and Maarten Boudry on my right side as well, about an article that Jerry Coyne wrote with Luana Maroja in the Skeptical Inquirer. This is a skeptical magazine published in the United States. The title of the article is The Ideological Subversion of Biology, and it appeared in July-August 2023. I suggest that we discuss the article here, that way people interested in the conversation can still learn about this topic. This approach is a bit of a stretch, of course. We would have loved to be in the hall of the University of Amsterdam, but that's the way it is. We will not go into detail about why Maarten Boudry and Jerry Coyne were not welcome in Amsterdam, but that conversation is off topic. If you're interested in it, I suggest that you read the website of Jerry Coyne, which provides all the information you're looking for. That website is called Why Evolution is True. At the end of this conversation, we will see if the conversation should have raised any concerns at the University of Amsterdam. And that's the last word about it. We are very pleased to have Jerry Coyne, Maarten Boudry, and Michael Richardson present here. Could you please introduce yourselves? And I would like to start with you, of course, since you're from the other side of the ocean.
Well, Gert-Jan, and I apologize for my Dutch. Already introduced me. I'm emeritus faculty at the University of Chicago. I taught evolutionary biology, and that's still my interest, evolutionary genetics. And that gave rise to the paper because it's about the incursion of ideology into the field of evolutionary biology.
Thank you. Maarten?
I'm Maarten Boudry. I work at the University of Ghent, although I'm actually self-employed right now. But I was the first holder of the Etienne Vermeer's chair. That probably doesn't ring a bell in the US, but he was a well-known Flemish atheist and philosopher, a little bit like Richard Dawkins perhaps, who died 5 years ago. So the U Ghent erected a chair in his honor, and I was the first holder of that chair. And in recent years, I'm a bit all over the place. So my PhD was on pseudoscience. I've done research in cultural evolution, climate policy, and science and ideology has been one of my long-time interests, I think.
Thank you. And Mike Richardson, who are you?
I am, Michael Richardson, Professor of Animal Development at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. And I am an evolutionary embryologist. The field is called Evo-Devo, so it looks at embryonic development in the context of evolution. And I've been involved in some controversies about evolution and creationism in my time.
We'll probably get into that later.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's get back to the article, The Ideological Subversion of Biology. The introduction states, a tad alarmingly in my view, biology faces a grave threat from progressive politics that are changing the way our work is done, delimiting areas of biology that are taboo and will not be funded by the government or published in scientific journals, stipulating what words biologists must avoid in their writing, and decreeing how biology is taught to students and communicated to other scientists and the public through the technical and popular press. The article discusses 6 examples, but I suggest we first pay attention to the introduction of the article and then move on to the examples. What I find very interesting is a few points in this introduction, and let's start with the organization of how does this actually work. I read in the introduction, scientists both inside and outside the academy were among the first to begin politically purging their fields by misrepresenting or even lying about inconvenient truths. That sounds heavy. How is this organized? Can you shed any light on that, Professor Coyne?
Well, I guess I'm not quite clear what you're asking. Why is it scientists that are doing this? Or?
Yeah, how does this work?
Well, it works.
Why do scientists do these kind
Well,
of
scientists,
things?
like most people in general these days, tend to, well, academics are generally in America left-wing and progressive, and that side of the political spectrum in America is becoming more and more censorious. It's becoming more and more canceled culturally. And this, although I was surprised, as I say in the article, that this would apply to science, it has. So it's applied in a number of ways, as we talk in the article. The terms you use have to be policed. You have to change your view of nature. For example, you cannot say there are two sexes. You have to say there's a spectrum of sex. It's become unpalatable to regard individual humans as genetically different from one another. The evolutionary psychology, which is the view that our minds reflect our ancestry, has become taboo. Indigenous science, which is the science of local people, has become sacralized. And the very topic of race or genetic differences between populations is absolutely taboo to mention. And these are all progressive views from the left, but Maarten could probably, because he deals with things like climate change, this kind of censoriousness also comes from the right.
But scientists organize these views among themselves, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, we're people, and this shows more than anything else that we are regular people, because scientists are behaving politically rather than scientifically and trying to turn their disciplines into something that's politically correct.
Okay. What's your take on this? Is this a typically American phenomenon, or do we see that on our side of the ocean as well?
Well, we definitely do see it on our side of the ocean. It's probably not as bad as in the US, I would say. Like, everything is very polarized and partisan in the US, so the extremes on both ends tend to be more pronounced. But it's definitely often with some delay, the things just drift over here, and we see the same things happening in our universities. There's also there's a difference in our language community. For example, I'm not going to shame any universities by just listing them in ranking them in terms of wokeness or political correctness, but there are differences, and I think UVA is one of the worst offenders. So I am actually shaming them now, but. So yes, it happens not just in biology. If you look at the statistics of the political orientations of scientists, many of these statistics are coming out of the US, but we do have some data in the Netherlands and Belgium as well. A colleague of mine recently published a book in Dutch, a philosopher and political scientist. Basically, the title translates as "Is left or leftists just smarter?" And of course, it's an ironic title because this is sometimes the reply that you get when you point out the fact that many scientists in almost all fields tend to be more progressive or on the left. Like, yeah, of course. I mean, when you study reality, I think Stephen Colbert once said that reality has a well-known progressive bias.
It's a remark I very much like.
Yes, exactly. So, but if you look at the statistics of political orientation of Belgian and Dutch scientists, you see exactly the same thing. So there's a huge discrepancy or asymmetry between left-wing and right-wing people, which is more pronounced in some fields than in others. But there's almost no scientific field that is right-wing. It's just less progressive. Like economics, for example, is obviously more right-wing, but still, compared to the rest of society, it's still left-leaning, which is not a problem per se. But as Jerry pointed out, when everyone has more or less the same ideology, then you share the same blind spots. And one of the corrective mechanisms in science is peer review. You need to have people with opposing viewpoints, both from the left and from the right, to correct each other's biases and mistakes. And what we see in a lot of scientific disciplines is that this is no longer happening. And because of the polarization in the rest of society, I think also it feeds into each other. So the more society is drifting towards the right, I think the more academics who tend to be on the left are digging in their heels and saying we're going to be even more political now because we have to defend ourselves against these encroachments from the right.
Maarten, isn't science about facts and figures and research, not about opinion at all?
Well, yes, it's supposed to be. That's the ideal. That's the ideal, of course. And I actually I am a little bit more, like for example, I don't really believe in the ideal scientist as somebody who's completely free of prejudice and preconceptions. I think it's fine for scientists to have their political opinions. I'm a believer in the view of David Hull, who's actually also like a biologist and a philosopher, that it's fine for scientists to have their biases, but you have to put, or you're supposed to put trust in the social structure of science. It's the social structure that makes sure that is correcting for these biases, and you shouldn't never trust any individual scientist. So, yes, I think science is supposed to be objective at the collective level, not so much on the individual level. But you need to have a diversity of viewpoints in order for that to,
Yeah, and one of the problems is, of course, that with everybody on the same ideological side, we don't have that self-correcting mechanism anymore. Yeah. So if you say, for example, there are more than two sexes in humans or anything else, who's going to correct that? Well, somebody like me, but then you get in trouble for saying that, and you get sort of deplatformed in ways. So.
Okay. Please share with us, how does this work in practice in your faculty when you teach and research? Do you see the same things in your work?
No, I don't. I mean, I agree with Jerry that in these areas that he's identified, which are kind of flashpoint areas which have a strong political context, people are frightened of doing the wrong thing. In many fields of, say, biomedical research, there's really no issue at all, except in ethics, perhaps. But I'm more interested in why these areas have become flashpoints of conflict between science and politics. And I think if you look at, for example, race, which, then you have population genetics, anthropology people there will be very sensitive about what they do and what they say. One of the reasons that flared up, say, recently was because of the murder of George Floyd in the States, which caused a huge, understandable outrage. And after that, universities were frightened of doing anything that could possibly be tainted with accusations of racism, and then all connections with slavery were abolished. People, universities and people were taking down statues of slavers. So there was a climate on certain areas that historically had a lot of baggage and that recently had flared up because of tragic events. So I think we should also look at the reasons behind why you do have these flashpoints. But I think they are flashpoints. They're not, I don't think they're pervasive in all fields by any means.
This is interesting because one of the things that popped in my mind when I read the article was that aren't we somehow talking about the results of science being interpreted in different ways in the political arena? For instance, you yourself state the example of the discussion about vaccines. Is there any misunderstanding in the scientific community about vaccines? I don't think so. And is there even any trace of disagreement on evolution among evolutionary biologists?
No, there's some. I mean, historically, that battle is pretty much over. The sociobiology battle, on the other hand, is still continuing. But in the biomedical area, I would take a little bit of issue with you because in America, medical schools are a hotbed of controversy, and most of it is involved by race. So, for example, they've eliminated a lot of standardized testing of medical students because it violates what they call equity, equal representation of groups. And there's the historical deplatforming of people, which to my view somewhat distorts the history of science. It's like everybody is sniffing out all famous scientists to see if they ever did anything bad in their lives. So I can't think of an area, but biomedical is probably the least affected. The article we wrote is mostly about, in fact, it's all about evolutionary biology, because that's my field and Luana's field. So it just gave an example of how one area is tainted, but also we give examples of physics and chemistry and medicine where the same phenomenon applies. And the references are in the paper. So I urge people watching to actually read the paper to look at the other examples or references.
Yeah, the paper contains hot links which lead directly to all kind of background information.
Yeah, there's lots of references. We were not allowed by the magazine, nor do we want to make any kind of factual statement without a reference to it. So that's one reason we haven't received much criticism for the article. We get criticized because people don't like what we say, but they've never been able to successfully criticize the facts that we've adduced.
Yeah, perhaps I want to make one more comment about the flashpoints. I think you're right. Of course, it doesn't affect all of science. I mean, it's hard to talk about the proportion or the percentage of science, but there's definitely parts of science that are almost completely ideologically neutral. Like, it doesn't really matter if you're a particle physicist, for example, if you're on the left or on the right, because protons or neutrons don't really have any ideological affiliation or whatever.
Yeah, or a botanist. I mean,
yeah, or a
this is
botanist.
fairly
There's plenty
uncontroversial.
of fields. Although even there, you could sometimes in the nomenclature and the concepts that are being used, but then it's mostly on the surface and it doesn't really affect like the substance of the scientific work. Of course, I'm mostly interested in the domains where you do see ideological biases. The point I was making about intellectual diversity in scientific communities actually is also important, even leaving aside political and ideological differences, because even among particle physicists, of course, you have camps, you have tribes, you have research communities, and if you have a journal where everyone is on the same side, not a political side, of course, then you get the same things. You get people reinforcing each other's blind spots. But I would also, I think, I would agree with Jerry that the number of flashpoints has been increasing over the past couple of decades, I think. Also in ways that perhaps we would not have predicted beforehand, like, really, this is also now controversial? I mean, there was a debate in the 90s, remember the famous book by Paul Gross and Norman Levitt, I think it was called Higher Superstition.
Yes.
So in some sense, this feels a little bit like a déjà vu or a rehash of earlier things like the sociobiology wars that you mentioned. But I don't think back then, to take a specific example, that the binary nature of sex, just a definition in terms of the mobility and the size and the number of gametes, was really a flashpoint back then. And it has become a flashpoint over time in perhaps ways that even Gross and Levitt would not have predicted or expected. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, as Michael said, we'd like to understand why this is happening. So would I. But that sort of involves psychology, which is not my forte. I prefer to show the bad things that are happening. And the difference between now and what was happening with sociobiology and evolution is threefold. First of all, it affects all scientific fields to some degree. I would add, positionality statements in articles saying, I'm a gay white male that was brought up this way. That was completely unknown 10 years ago. So it affects all scientific fields. In biology, it affects much more than evolutionary biology. It affects almost everything. And second of all, the motivation is coming, unlike for, say, sociobiology and creationism, is coming from scientific people themselves. So it's the scientists themselves that have created this fracas. And for example, for evolutionary biology and creationism, that wasn't coming from science, it came from religion.
Well, yeah, but I think it's not just scientists who are kind of self-policing to make sure that they're doing the right thing, but managers, university managers and authorities are very frightened of reputational damage, and there's been a move, for example, at my alma mater, University College, to detoxify the legacy of Francis Galton having worked there. And he was one of the founders of eugenics, which was a crazy idea that you could improve the human race by getting rid of, basically it boiled down to getting rid of people who aren't nice middle-class people. And it was crazy on a scientific level. But there's this sense that, oh my God, we've had this terrible past and we've done terrible things, and science has committed these appalling atrocities, whether they were theoretical or real. And, of wanting to avoid any further bad press. And that's a very strong motivator for controlling what science does. Although I should say in Leiden, we are very tolerant, because Leiden has a long history of tolerance of different opinions. Not that I'm saying Amsterdam is particularly intolerant, but
of course
it varies between universities.
Yeah. But do you have cooperations with colleagues in the United States, for instance, that made you aware of the things that Jerry was talking about?
I'm aware that it's worse in the States than it is here. I think the degree of political control over what scientists say and do and what they say publicly about politics, it must be quite oppressive.
Yeah, although I have to say that the reason we're having this discussion here instead of at a university is because of a degree of ideological polarization, which is here, but we don't see in America. So there is some difference, but it's in a different direction.
It's another flashpoint area, you know, when there's something hot in society, people will have to shut up because people are angry. Yeah. Maybe I'm trying to analyze why this happens rather than condemn the phenomenon, but I think...
yeah, I wish I knew.
Yeah.
Except that I could only speculate, you know. I think that's the domain of psychologists.
But I think it's actually, if I can make a connection to a point that you raised earlier, it is actually often caused by earlier attacks on science coming from the right wing. So in the case of eugenics, of course, there's this whole history. Well, perhaps it was not really an attack on science by the right wing. It was something, but more like a right-wing bias of within science. But the area I was thinking of foremost is climate science, because of course there's been a whole history, especially in the 80s and the 90s, of a concerted effort by the fossil fuel industry and by certain pro-capitalists, pro-enterprise.
As an example.
Yes, but it is it's something now. And I mean, what has happened is interesting. This is also something that is mostly an American affair. I mean, you do have climate denialists in Belgium and the Netherlands here, but they don't really have a lot of political clout. And in a country like Germany, for example, they never had any political clout, at least for the past 20 or 30 years. But because of that very real attack on science coming from the right wing, not so much from scientists themselves, although there have been some dissenters, like them sometimes paid or like bribed by the fossil fuel industry, sometimes not, sometimes they're just contrarians who just like to be the lone dissenter in the scientific community.
But you could also call them commercial interests instead of politically right wing.
Commercial interests, politically right wing, yes. So there's a mishmash of different ideological motivations going on there. But the point I want to make is that because of that history of right-wing attacks on science, there has been some sort of a overcompensation within the scientific community, where in climate science, for example, anyone who even dares to suggest that perhaps the future of the climate will not be as catastrophic as it is often portrayed, even in high-profile journals like Science and Nature, is immediately branded as either a denialist or a climate skeptic or somebody who's pandering to the denialists and the skeptics. And the difference there is, again, just as in the case of biology, this is coming from within the scientific community. So I think, I mean, and this is something that I say with regret because I love science, and I actually for a long time I believed that climate science, because it's experimental, it's like hard, it's robust, it's impervious to ideological influences. Well, I regret to inform you, but even climate science, not just climate policy, but even climate science has been also infected to some extent, not of course the reality of climate change itself, but a very one-sided picture that we get where only the negative effects of climate change itself are being highlighted, and the positive effects of mitigation policies, and not like a balanced view of both, like a risk-benefit analysis of both the mitigation policies and climate change itself. I think, and this is getting worse, and it is getting worse exactly because scientists have become a bit too complacent or smug because they are aware of this whole history of right-wing attacks coming from outside of the scientific community. So they have the sense that like we have to defend ourselves, we have to push back against this right-wing attack, and that has actually caused them to swing too far in the opposite direction.
Well, a lot of that's coming from the media, and particularly the scientific media, because I recently had not a run-in, but a discussion with Nature, the journal Nature, and they had this weekly science, it was called a science briefing that they would send you by email, and I had to cancel it because it was just, there was no science, it was just heavy politics. Yeah. And one entire issue of Science Weekly Briefing from Nature was devoted to climate change activism, whatever you like to call it, and I said, look, this is not the business of a science journal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to her great credit, the editor of Nature emailed back and said, well, yes, okay, Nature has been accused of politicizing science. But again, you see these flashpoint issues become they get taken up by the media. So we have the media putting pressure on scientists, we have the university management putting pressure on scientists, and then scientists putting pressure on themselves and their colleagues in these specific areas that we keep returning to, actually.
Yeah.
Let's discuss a little bit about the mechanism. You say you talk about the managers. You talk about how discussions in society influence the things we're discussing. Jerry points to two mechanisms in his article by which these processes work. He points to deterrence, the chilling of research that prevents scientists from studying or teaching certain problems, and direct action, taking classes away from professors who make points that are not really appreciated. As someone who works in a political environment myself, I know these processes and these mechanisms exist, but there are also structures and processes that drive these mechanisms. Often funding is an important mechanism to...
Sorry,
funding, yes. And I would like to hear a little bit more about that. Could we go into that? Why are managers worried? Why would they even think about this? Why organize deterrence and direct action?
Well, because fear works. You do create a climate of fear if you threaten people with their job, with being the subject of horrible press reporting or protests. So these tools are very effective for keeping people quiet. And you will end up with this, using these sanctions that Jerry mentions, these mechanisms, very effective at making scientists say, well, we better avoid anything controversial. I mean, I'm slightly frightened myself of ever doing anything that might be controversial, unless it's about arguing a scientific point. And then I will stick to my guns. But if it were something talking about genetic differences between populations, human populations, I would avoid that at all costs, because it's you're frightened that you're going to make a misstep and that could affect your career.
Yeah, that's why I'm glad I'm retired now, because I don't have to worry about that. The stuff about differences between populations, which is one of our 6 taboo areas, i.e. races, I call them populations. I mean, that's very important. Everybody in the world practically has had a DNA test now to determine where their ancestry came from. Well, you couldn't do that if everybody in the world was genetically the same. Or David Reich, or who's the guy that won the Nobel Prize for fossil DNA?
Fossil DNA?
Yeah.
Everybody seems to have forgotten.
Yeah, Neanderthal, the Neanderthal, yes.
Yeah, so all that stuff and tracing the history of human migration throughout the world could not be done if human populations were genetically the same. So, you know, I could write that in this article, but if I couldn't teach it. You know, I'd be accused of being a racist just by admitting the fact that human populations are genetically different from one another. Now, what you do with those differences becomes somewhat of a societal problem, and that's the sort of flashpoint. But it's nipped in the bud by those people that say this area is completely off limits. We cannot research that. And in fact, the National Institutes of Health has a very large database of people who I think divided by their self-designated race, white, black, Hispanic, etc. And then there's also data about their income, their educational attainment and stuff. The NIH, as far as I know, will not allow that data to be made public, even though we Americans have paid for that data to be collected, because you can't even get it for a single race because people are so afraid of how it could be misused. So,
well, I think the genomics has overpowered that particular flashpoint, if you like, because all the genomes are there, they're sequenced, they're available on NCBI to anybody to download and check. So there's really no contest anymore about there being genetic differences between populations, but it all comes in the interpretation. And people are quite rightly cautious that they don't want to say that this group of people are somehow inferior genetically to this group of people. So it's absolutely right to be cautious.
oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's a whole history of the misuse of that. On the other hand, you shouldn't ignore it. I mean, we'll disagree in your assertion that everybody knows that populations genetically different from one another, because I think the first word in our discussion of race there is from the American Medical Association that says race is a purely social construct without any biological meaning whatsoever. And that is a deeply misleading statement. It implies that the whole concept of ethnic differences, population differences, is something that's a social construct and therefore not worth studying scientifically.
No, it's both. It's race, it's genetics, it's culture, it's learning passed down, which is culture. So it's a very, it's clearly a mixture of genetics and environment, in the same way that disease genes and exposure to disease-causing agents, you have to look at both. But yeah, again, I would say just be careful. And some scientists have been rather less than careful in making distinctions between populations.
Yeah, but we should just recognize that. I think Ernst Mayr made this point in his 1962 book on evolution, that the big problem is to assume that moral equality implies identity. And this is one of the points of our paper, is to say that you don't have to be identical to everybody else in anything in order to be morally equal in many ways. That's not a hard point to really grasp, because morality is a social construct. It does not depend on the biological reality.
And it can be shared by whichever human subpopulations care to share it. So indeed, it's not restricted. Morality is not restricted to one group or another.
Can I would like to ask you something specific as maybe a way of asking one more question about the organization of this process. In the article, Jerry points to the Lysenko affair, a Soviet scientist who fabricated results to show that agricultural crops could adapt to other climates. That fitted, of course, very well within Stalin's ideological alley at that time. So here you saw the government attacking science. We also know how well that ended, of course. I'm an economist myself, and we showed that central planning in the Soviet Union could not lead to the prosperity needed to compete really with strong market economies. So never mind if you even promote the Lysenko nonsense. My question comes here. Do you now see organization from the government or other agencies against science in the Western world? We primarily discussed the process in which scientists and journalists and opinion forming in the society at large plays a role, but is there any kind of anti-science organization working from the government?
Well, not in the sense of the Communist Party and under Stalin's regime, of course. In that sense, I think the Lysenko affair can be a bit of a red herring, because then the people who pretend that there's no problem, like who just want to whitewash science, pretend like that we're just all of this is just a figment of our imagination, will just point to Stalin and say, well, I mean, as long as people are not deported to concentration camps or to the gulags, like, what are you worrying about? I mean, literally, Lysenko's opponents were being shot, like they were really being like physically eliminated. Yeah. Of course, that is not happening, but the thing is, it's much more invidious and subtle what is happening now, because of course there's no comparison to Stalinist Russia and to what happened under the Lysenko affair, but in terms of the possible harms that it might cause, of course it is a very important warning, and I think that we have to be more mindful of more subtle mechanisms that can achieve very similar effects. So you don't necessarily need to send people to the gulags or physically eliminate or kill them to have this kind of incursion of ideology in science. I think actually, and there's a lot of social psychology about this, that it only takes a small group of very radical and stubborn people to enforce their view on the rest of society because of this thing called pluralistic ignorance. So if everyone just keeps silent because this person believes, if I believe that I'm the only one who doesn't think that sex is a social construct and is a spectrum, but since everyone around me seems to think the same thing, like I'm not gonna just jump in the fray and just gonna refrain from expressing my view. But if everyone thinks exactly along the same lines, you can have a situation in which only 10% of the population of the group actually believes the ideologically correct thing. The 90% of the rest are just being cowardly, or they just sincerely believe that they are the only dissenters, which they're not. So I think what is happening, and especially when it comes to physics, and I think even in the statement that you just mentioned about biology being a social construct, sex being a completely cultural and social construct, I have
that was race, actually. So
that was race, sorry.
Race.
Yeah. What statement was that? Was that from
race is a purely social construct,
right,
without any biological consequences.
I think in a lot of these cases, and of course I can't peer into people's heads, but I think they know better. I think they're just making some sort of performative gesture, just signaling that I'm on the right side, like I'm just going to throw you something that you can see that I'm actually pandering to your ideology, but deep down I actually know better. It's still, I mean, it's still perverse because it still has these negative consequences that if everyone is doing that, of course, everyone will believe that, like, okay, I'm going to lie about it, but since everyone else seems to actually believe it, I'm just, I'm going to shut up. And that's very subtle and that's pragmatic, but I think it's no less dangerous or invidious, I think, even if I don't really believe, and I don't think Jerry believes that either, that people are going to be shot or sent to concentration camps. That's obviously not what is happening. But it's the more subtle mechanisms, I think, that we have to pay more attention to, because you can achieve the same effect.
We have to be. We have to realize that we operate within society. We're funded by the government. Parents choose to send their children to us. We have to be a little bit pragmatic and make, when there's a flashpoint, we have to try not to, well, I hate to use a terrible cliche, but pour gasoline on the fire. Be pragmatic and try to understand what society thinks. But I just wanted to pick up something you asked about whether the government imposes constraints on science. Yes, it does. In a way, in the area, for example, of animal rights. Which I didn't read in Jerry's article as being one of the 6 cardinal points, but in the field of animal rights, because of public protests and pressure about some of the frankly horrible experiments that were being done on animals, governments now, especially in Europe, have really clamped down on the rules about what you may and may not do in animal experiments, and I'm completely in support of that. And also in other areas where you have very burdensome legislation, if you want to collect any biological samples, say in Australia or India, the mountain of paperwork that you have to go through, and regulations and wildlife permits and export permits and the Nagoya Protocol, all of this has greatly slowed down work on biodiversity and on something we discuss later, Indigenous medicines. It's just really impossible to get any kind of sample out of these countries anymore. And that's from the governments, of course, clamping down on scientific endeavors.
True, but I would say that, I mean, they're clamping down on certain kinds of experiments. They're not enforcing some sort of viewpoint or ideology.
Which ones? The animal rights or the
government or the animal rights activists? They just want to ban certain kinds of research, but they don't want you to think about animals or to believe things about animals in a certain way.
Well, no,
I mean, it would be different if they were enforcing their view that animals are sentient and conscious and whatever, and you should not do any research that violates that principle. Then I think it would be similar to the thing that Jerry is describing. But
well, there's also a political element to animal rights activism, which is that it was primarily targeted against big pharma, who were doing drug testing on rabbits, and multinational companies who were dripping cosmetics into eyes to look for irritation. That was partly, obviously, a genuine empathy for the animals who were suffering these indignities, but also a dislike, a hatred of big corporations. So that was one political driver. It wasn't just purely a welfare driver.
It is also a political driver, I agree, but I don't think it really affects the substance of the science. They're just, it's annoying to you, or at least, I mean, it prevents you from making certain discoveries, perhaps, because it's just so burdensome now to take into account all these regulations. But it's not enforcing an ideological belief, which I think is if anything, more dangerous? Because we all agree that there have to be some ethical rules, of course. There's some kinds of research that the government is right to ban, I guess, and I guess your argument is that they're pushing it too far, or they're just, making too many concessions to the animal rights activists.
As an issue. I should point out that I don't personally do nasty experiments on animals, so, but
Yeah.
Duly noted.
Yeah.
yes, thank you. Yes. But yes, that's an area where the government does limit science to some extent through legislation in those areas.
Right.
So, thank you for the discussion so far. And the article is in fact a strong advocacy for value-free science. But is value-free science really possible? That's maybe approaching the question from the other side. I think scientists always have to make moral judgments about what they research. And we discussed yesterday if there would be any subject a scientist simply shouldn't study. I was thinking myself about biological weapons. And secondly, of course, the resources for scientific research are not endless. Choices have to be made. On what topics would you do you devote budgets and time? So is value-free science possible, and is it something desirable to have? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I've talked about this with Maarten as a question I wanted to ask him. Clearly, you have to choose what you want to work on, and clearly, to all rational people, there are some experiments that should not be done, and the obvious ones are the ones that the Nazis did during World War II. Mengele experiments, putting prisoners in tanks of cold water or injuring them or stuff like that. Where it gets questionable is like studies of race and sex, where the American Medical Association will say that race is not a biological phenomenon. That's more or less a diktat that we're not going to publish anything that says otherwise. So that, that is sort of a statement that this kind of research should not be done. But I'll throw the question to Maarten about other kinds of research. Biological weapons, yeah, I think most people agree with that. And that is a mixture of science and morality. It's not pure science. But I'm pretty lax about, I think work can be done on race. That's good. You have to be careful about it. That's one thing we have to do, that some issues are politically touchy, as Michael said, and we have to make sure that what we produce is not misunderstood by the public and add the proper caveats and stuff. But in terms of the normal biology, where you're not involved in killing people or hurting people or putting them in tanks of water, beyond that, I can think of very few areas which more knowledge is not useful or could be useful. So,
yeah, I think I probably have to make a distinction between like ways of obtaining knowledge that should be banned. Of course, if you want to learn more about how bodies react to hypothermia, for example, well, obviously you should not just imprison people and put them against their will in tanks full of cold water. Yeah, but that's a way of obtaining knowledge. The knowledge itself about how bodies react to hypothermia is not dangerous. And if we could have, people with informed consent and who willingly participate in these experiments, or, knowledge can often be obtained in many different ways. The more interesting question is there any kind of knowledge that, no matter how you obtain it, no matter what's your strategy or what's your experiment that you want to conduct, is dangerous in and of itself. And then I guess, the closest thing that comes to mind are perhaps two things like the gain-of-function experiments on dangerous viruses. So and even there, of course, there are legitimate reasons on the pro side to investigate these things, because we want to anticipate where the next pandemic will be coming from. Or perhaps if anyone wants to make a bioweapon, for example, what's the most likely way to modify, the bird flu, for example, to make it more transmissible or more virulent. So it's nice to anticipate on that, or perhaps to proactively already develop a vaccine. But I also see that this could go horribly wrong, of course, because there have been lab leaks. So I guess, and the second example that comes to mind, and actually I recently wrote a paper about that, is the development of artificial intelligence in an evolutionary context. So very, very quickly, there's a lot of doom scenarios with artificial intelligence, but I think if anything, the scenarios that worry me the most are the scenarios in which you allow artificial intelligent agents to compete with each other in a truly Darwinian context, like a ruthless rat and tooth and claw context in which the strongest will survive and the AI that kills off all the other AIs will go to the next generation, etc. I think that would be really dangerous, because there's this thing called Leslie Orgul's second rule: evolution is cleverer than you are. So if you implement evolution in a context of like an artificial environment where just the computational speed is much faster, and if you breed selfish, ruthless agents, they might turn against us. And I think that kind of research perhaps should also be banned.
That's not science, that's technology, that's the application of science. So if
Sure,
you ask
yeah.
are there fields that you wouldn't touch with the barge pole in scientific research, a lot of the bad ones would be things that are actually more technology,
Right.
they're downstream applied science. And scientists shouldn't be blamed for example, if artificial intelligence robots attack each other, or if someone develops a nuclear bomb, or although that's kind of on the border, a lot of the horrors that come from science are in its application, and the scientists there have played little role in the actual application.
Well, except for the nuclear weapons in World War II.
That was hardcore
completely-
physics.
Yeah,
Yes.
that was
Yeah,
physicists,
that was
so-
hardcore physics.
But
Right.
I mean, here's a question I could throw out connected with Martin's. Given that we could, if there was a God, which I don't believe there is, but if we could have perfect knowledge of what would happen under certain circumstances, or how humans could react with hypothermia, and we could have that knowledge without having to do the experiments, is there any knowledge that we would not want to have at all? And I can't think of anything. I mean, the more knowledge we have, the better.
Yeah,
As
even if
long
it's
as we aren't-
inconvenient, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's disturbing, I think it's still better
Yeah.
to know where you are.
Yes,
Yeah.
I would say the work that Masters and Johnsons did which I think kind of they did. There was some child sex material that was in the documents, and I don't think that should be released. I think that's too horrible. Well, the Masters and Johnson sexuality study. Am I right?
I don't know, but I
well,
don't
they
think
looked
they
at human
studied
sexuality.
kids.
No, but they had a contact who was a paedophile, and he told them about his experiences with underage children. And they put that in, and I think that was just, I don't think that should have been in. I don't want to know about that, and it's not, well, it's illegal and it's not
But
right.
is it again not more about the way of obtaining the knowledge? If we could just have some knowledge for free
No,
about
the question
pedophilia,
was
for
whether-
example, that we could
question
use
was
to
whether-
protect children, then
Right, but
yeah.
the question was, is there any information, knowledge, data that we don't want to know about and we don't want to read and use? And yes, that I don't wish that to be used. And I think that I'm straying here slightly over my expertise, but I think we were talking about the Mengele experiments. Some of those concentration camp experiments, the data are still there, but the German government says this is not suitable for release because of the way it was obtained. I think I'm right in saying that, although I'll have to check.
I get
would
it.
agree with
It's
you.
kind of
That is
tainted
true.
by its origins. But just to quickly respond to your point about AI, of course, in that context, it would be a technological application if it's used by the army, for example, to develop like an AI killer robot. But it would be a kind of scientific investigation if it's just like the what is it, the game of life experiment. Like you just allow evolution to play out in a certain artificial environment just to see what happens and to learn more about evolution.
That's an experiment, yeah.
Then it's an experiment,
Yeah,
but the purpose is still to learn something, but it could still be dangerous if this thing goes rogue and turns against you, of course. But I guess we agree on that point.
Okay, thanks for this exchange. Let me ask you, do you see a solution? We discussed all kinds of aspects of values creeping into science. We discovered that science cannot be really completely value-free, but the gathering of knowledge is impeded too much at this time. Is there a solution for this problem? Mike, what do you think?
I was afraid you'd look at me first.
I can look at Jerry first as well.
Well, my solution was to write papers like this, papers that we had trouble publishing because they were heterodox, I mean, to speak the truth is often heterodox. If you say there's two sexes, it's heterodox. To say if there's psychological and evolved differences between men and women is heterodox, even though there's a possible, it's societally useful to recognize that. I think all we can do is point out both the ideological biases themselves as well as the scientific truths themselves. I think Maarten is right that most people recognize, for example, that there are two sexes, but that's the vociferous minority that controls the field. Yeah. And that vociferous minority comes from ideology. I'd like to put in the reason for that, which is that what I call, but there's probably a philosophical term for it, the reverse appeal to nature. So the naturalistic fallacy in philosophy is what you see in nature is good or ethically correct. I mean, that's dominated a lot of discussion for years, and there's many examples of it. For example, people looking for examples of same-sex behavior in the wild, like in the bonobo females, and saying, well, see, that tells you that it's okay to be homosexual in humans. It's completely irrelevant. It's okay to be homosexual in humans regardless of what chimps do. But this is this is an inversion of that. It's taking what we've decided is ideologically correct and trying to find it in nature. So for example, people will say, there's a whole spectrum of sex in humans. What they mean is gender roles, what you feel you are. But that becomes that there is a whole spectrum of biological sex, which is wrong. There's only two, males and females, and that's true of all animals and all vascular plants. And so what they've done is to read back into nature what they think is ideologically proper. That's a sort of different philosophical mistake. And I think that's at the bottom of at least everything that we write about in our paper. And the only way to correct this, I think, is you can point out the fallacy, but it's not going to work because these people are ideologically committed, or you can write scientifically, and I think this is probably more effective. Yes, there are only two sexes. This is the biological definition of sex, and it holds in all animals and all plants, and this is why. And we don't see a third sex, etc.
Well, I'd like to then jump back in now that I've been inspired by that conclusion. No, I think just briefly to pick up on the gay and what's natural in nature, you can invert that again because I was asked to write an article for the British magazine Gay Times, which is the sort of gay magazine, and they said, look, a lot of anti-gay people are saying that same-sex couplings or activity is unnatural because it doesn't occur in nature. So I then were able to produce a litany of examples where it does occur in nature. So that was yet another level of that argument. But going back to the general conclusions, how do we deal with these issues that Jerry has quite rightly raised? My advice, if I were to give advice to a young scientist, would be just be pragmatic and identify what are these small flashpoints that really, really upset people and a sufficiently vociferous number of people in society that is going to cause trouble. And just be pragmatic and don't, tread carefully on ground which contains a context which really, really upsets people and gets a visceral reaction.
Well, yeah, I'm all in favor of a... Sorry?
Isn't that in some way promoting a form of self-censorship?
Yes, I'm afraid so, Okay. I'm afraid so. I'm not brave enough like Jerry to stand up and,
That's a matter of
I want a
taste.
quiet life.
You're going to be
done
cancelled
it since
anyway.
you retired, so,
you're tainted by association
Yeah,
now.
but again, yeah, I've done it since I retired, but the incursion of ideology into science has really burgeoned since I retired. So I can't say nobody can accuse me of being a coward before that. But if somebody tells me, no, there's 5 sexes in humans, or 7, as they have written, I would find it hard not to say, no, you're wrong.
Oh, I would give them the facts, because I'm an embryologist, so I'd have no choice.
Yeah, but I don't see how I should. I mean, the only other way to deal with them is, well, let's sit down and discuss why you think that. And then you have this long discussion, and maybe you change their minds and maybe you don't. I, for one, am not willing to
Maarten,
do that. So.
Maarten, can you
Yeah.
give some historical context maybe? Because what I was thinking is the problems we're discussing, aren't they of all times?
Oh, they definitely are. I mean, the social mechanisms that are
And how
playing in the background here,
how
of
did
course, are as old as
previous
time.
generations reach a solution?
Sorry?
How did previous generations reach a solution then?
Yeah, there was in Greek societies there was this, the role for what is it called, the paresia, so the truth teller, somebody who has like a designated job of speaking up, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's rude or whatever, and he will not be punished for it. I think that is very important today, and even though in other contexts I'm all in favor of pragmatism, like I'm a very down-to-earth person, and I think like, yeah, of course you have to make some compromises and you cannot always be radical and stubborn. But I do think that sometimes there can be something insidious about pragmatism, because every time you're being pragmatic and you self-censor a little bit, or you refrain from speaking out about something, or you stay silent or whatever, or you decide not to apply for a research grant or not to submit a paper, you're moving the needle ever so slightly. And I think it's okay to be a coward on the one hand if you're really in fear of your professional position or even of your physical safety, because I mean this can also happen. Again, we're not going to mention the reason why we're here without an audience.
Thank you.
Yeah. but it is something. I mean, one of the justifications that was being put forward is, I'm not sure if that was right, but there was some concerns about physical safety. So it's okay to be a coward in that respect. But I do think, as Jerry already mentioned, these people, they're not that numerically strong. It's a small minority of very stubborn people that are influential because they have, through all these social mechanisms that are very, very old and much older than the ideology itself, have intimidated everyone else into shutting up. And the thing that always strikes me is that on numerous occasions, a fellow academic has buttonholed me at a reception, for example, or on private occasions, like, "Oh, I'm very glad that you wrote that piece on whatever about ideology and science in biology, for example, because I published an op-ed about these things, about transgenderism, for example, and about gender studies, or about Islam and migration, all these flashing points." And so they tell me like, "Oh, I'm glad that you did that because I agree with you." But then when I mentioned, "Oh, I would actually appreciate it even more if you said that publicly," and it's like, no, this is I'm not going to do that. And I perfectly understand it, but you do every time somebody makes a pragmatic decision like that, I can understand it from a personal point of view, but it is having an effect collectively, because all these small pragmatic decisions add up, and at the end of the day, all of a sudden we get the impression like, does nobody really know the basic biological facts about sex, for example? I mean, we used to agree about that 20 years ago. How have all these prestigious scientific institutions suddenly changed their mind? I don't even believe that they changed their mind. It's just purely pandering to ideology, but but the spell has to be broken. There has to be like the story about the emperor and the naked clothes, where the little boy points it out. We need more people like that, I think, also people who sometimes make unpragmatic decisions, regardless of the consequences.
Any of the rules, maybe make sure that the tenureship of a professor is more stable, and that she or he can say more easily what she or he would like to say? Could we define the rules in a different way to facilitate this process?
Yeah, you can always be sacked for bringing the university into disrepute, and then, so that can be interpreted in 100 different ways. Any transgression they wish to fire you for, that can be fitted into that category.
But that's probably that's a relatively extreme case. I can't really think of a lot of examples of tenured professors that are fired unless they did something horribly wrong, like rape a student or something. And then, of course, it's right for them to be fired. Or plagiarism, yes, that's another example. But I think the more subtle mechanisms, I think, are actually more dangerous. It's not, tenured professors are not really afraid of being fired. They're afraid of being shunned by their colleagues.
No, but one was recently fired at University College London for, he made a stupid sexist remark, about women's places being a technician or something like that. And he was a Nobel Prize winner, but they said, sorry, this is unacceptable.
I hadn't heard of that. Is
he
that
was
very
fired.
recent? Yeah. Yeah, so then it's even worse than I expected.
But could we change when we draw a conclusion from this conversation? Could we give a piece of advice to the university managers? What would be our advice? Before I delve into example 6, I would like to know that. What would be your advice?
Well, there are flashpoints, and their job is to manage the reputational damage, but not to lash out and start threatening people and sacking people and making people feel unsafe, that they're under some kind of tyranny from wherever it's being imposed. You know, just do your job and manage the media response to any of these controversies.
So they should have your back.
Yeah, absolutely, but I think often they're frightened of being fired because they don't have tenure.
So maybe a more stable position for these people would help.
But would also help in media
Good.
training.
Media, okay, good. What's your take? What can we advise to university managers?
Well, I mean, given that I think the pushback is coming mostly from scientists themselves and not university managers. In terms of university managers, I'd agree with Michael. In terms of scientists, I was just thinking about how in the past we've corrected big scientific ideological errors, and the one I thought of was eugenics. Because back in the 1930s, every evolutionary biologist was pretty much a eugenicist and said, well, there's the smart people and the dumb people, we should sterilize the young people, we should sterilize those people labeled mentally defective, and there's also a racial component to that as well. Now that's gone. And I'm just trying to think why it went away. Well, first of all, the self-correcting nature of science, but I think philosophy must have played some role in this, right? That it's just
Do
wrong.
we deserve some credit for that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, you're the philosopher.
Yeah. No,
So-
yeah, I also believe the self-corrective mechanisms that are inherent in science.
Let
Also,
me interrupt for a
climate
second,
denialism,
though,
for
that-
example. Sorry?
I mean, the fact is, eugenics will work. If you want to breed humans, you can make anything you want out of them. I mean, Darwin was the one that said that animals and plants are quite plastic. You can make them in anything you want. That's also true of humans. We have genetic variation for almost any trait, so we could breed any kind of human we wanted, but it's not considered, this is the kind of experiment we don't want to do. So,
Well,
anyway.
you made a good point in the paper that many traits that are under selection are in fact polygenic, and there's hundreds of genes controlling them, and some
Yeah.
of them are linked. And so if you get rid of, going back to eugenics, if you breed against, say, criminality, you will also breed against people who are very bold and don't have a conscience, and who would be great in an army. So, you know, if you start selecting for one trait, you're going to have a whole nightmare scenario.
Yeah, but you could unselect for, I mean, the fact is that all the plants and animals we eat or used, like the cows I saw driving to Tilburg yesterday, they're completely different from their wild ancestors. Of course, we have to keep them from reverting by keeping them in, you know, to a standard, but eugenics went away because of philosophy, didn't
Yeah,
it?
it's not really because we figured out that it wouldn't work. It's more
Yeah.
that we figured out that even though it would work, it's just not morally acceptable.
That should have dawned on them earlier.
That's right. Yeah, well, what should universities do? I think just perhaps one thing, they should not take sides. They don't, and I also don't expect the universities to take my side. I don't expect them to say there are only two sexes and whatever. This is also not in the subject that I'm not going to mention. But the reason that we're being cancelled here is also one of those areas where the universities tend to take sides because they're under the pressure of activists. The George Floyd murder in the US is another example. Very understandable, of course. I mean, it really looked like nothing was more black and white in moral terms. But still, I think even under those circumstances, universities should resist the temptation to take sides because it creates a precedent. The next time the activists are going to say, well, what about climate change? What about Israel? What about transgenderism? Shouldn't you also take sides? Because you know, if you did this, then you have to do. It's a series of domino tiles or whatever. Doesn't your university have a?
I wanted to put in
the Calvin
a
report.
plug for the University of Chicago. We have institutional neutrality called embodied in what Maarten said is true, the Calvin report. Our university does not take sides on any political, ideological, or moral question unless it has a direct effect on the university's functioning itself. An example of that would be, for example, when the DACA proceedings came down, which would allow people that came here and were illegal to be deported, the university took a stand against that because it would have diminished our student population. But for every other thing, you know, the students and often the faculty are crying, take a side, take a side. And the university will just say, no, we're institutionally neutral. For example, when the war started on October 7th between Hamas and Israel, the only thing the university said, you can see all these statements from different universities taking sides or taking both sides at the same time. Our university said there's a war on, people are feeling bad about it. If you need psychological support, here's where you get it. And that's as far as we went. And because of that, our president has not been hauled before Congress like the other presidents have. We have not gotten in any trouble. We have not lost any donors. The sad thing is that there's only about 5 universities in the United States, I don't know if there's any in Europe, that are institutionally neutral. University of North Carolina, at Chapel Hill, there's 3 or 4 others. And that's very few compared to the fact that there's about 3,000 universities in the United States. Institutional neutrality, to me, makes the most sense because it not only keeps you, you know, in the middle, but protects freedom of speech. If you don't take a side in a war, if you don't take a side in, on transgenderism or anything, then people can say what they want without fear of punishment from the university. So if you're worried about the university taking ideological sides or punishing people for being on the wrong sides, the best way to avoid that is to declare yourself like the Switzerland of universities.
Yeah, that's very pragmatic, which is what I've been arguing for all the way through.
But that's for university. I think, yeah, I would totally buy your argument for pragmatism in the case of universities. Because they just have to facilitate the unpragmatic people who make a stance and
they have to
and defend their
accommodate
point.
that whole boiling pot of
Yeah.
you know, academics and with strange ideas and creative thinkers and radical students, and all of that's boiling in one pot. So they have to just keep the lid on it by saying we don't take sides.
That's a very satisfying conclusion.
Yeah, but is there any European university that adheres
I think
to
it's
this?
great. Did you say Calvin or Kelvin?
Calvin, K-A-L-V-E-N.
Oh, not our Calvin.
No.
Thank goodness.
be,
no, that
exactly
would not be.
neutral.
No.
I think we have time for delving for a short while into one of the examples. I noticed that the example that leads to the most discussion is example 6, indigenous ways of knowing. You present in your article 6 examples where ideological subversion exists, and the last one is indigenous ways of knowing. These are, you say, these are being positioned as equivalent to modern science and should be respected and taught as such. Traditional knowledge is often lauded as an alternative version of modern science, a way of knowing developed independently from what's called colonialist science. And rightly you state that practical knowledge is not the same as systematic, objective investigation of nature, free from assumptions about gods and spirits that constitute modern science. My first thought was, who would support any other stance? But then I discovered that a lot of people say, well, indigenous knowledge has led us to medicine that we wouldn't have discovered using a scientific process.
And sometimes, yes, it has.
Is that a valid argument?
It is a valid argument. I would never say that indigenous peoples have not contributed to what we call science. The prime example, of course, is drugs like quinine, for example. But again, to show that quinine is effective against malaria, you have to go through a Western medical procedure of double-blind testing. So it's not, the indigenous science contributed to the totality of what we have as knowledge, but the number of examples that we have like that is small. I mean, about 1/3 to 1/4 of drugs on this pharmaceutical counters derive from plants, but they don't derive from indigenous knowledge. They derive from people going out in the field and just collecting everything. That's how they got some cancer-causing drugs like vincristine and just trying them and see if they work. That's not indigenous knowledge, although it's derived from local places. So
Well, it may
this-
be informed by Indigenous knowledge.
Sorry?
It may be informed by Indigenous
Oh,
knowledge
yeah.
because a group of people say, well, we use this for treating malaria, so they screen that. So they're kind of pre-screened by the Indigenous people.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's just that I'm saying that the proportion of drugs that we use that has been discovered in that way is very small. People always point to the same examples over and over
Well, the
again.
other great malaria drug after quinine is the artemisins, which came from a Chinese, under Mao Zedong actually, initiative to look at traditional Chinese medicines for malaria and see if they could find an anti-malarial, and they did, and they got the Nobel Prize for it. So there's quite a lot coming out of traditional medicine where these medicines have been pre-screened, if you like, by the people. Non-scientifically, but
Yeah.
they've said, well, this one is actually quite good for curing my headache, or we take this one for fever. And you're given a lead, so...
But if they are
indigenous
later
knowledge-
adopted by Western science, of course, then it's not really an alternative in the way that they're proposing. So they're saying there are two ways of knowing. You have the Western, European way of knowing, and then you have indigenous ways of knowing. Of course, to the extent that they're compatible and that quinine, what's the way to pronounce it? That's the bark from the quinoa tree, right?
Cinchona tree, yeah.
I mean, to the extent that, of course, it has been validated by so-called Western science, even though I don't like that term. There's not a conflict, of course, but when it comes to mythology about origin stories, for example, and this is actually something that was already discussed in 1994 in the Gross and Levitt book, because I remember that there were these indigenous tribes in the US who also believed that, they had their own origin stories about, I don't even know exactly what the details were, but they had always been living there for millions of years, and I think they evolved from some sort of animals.
They've always been here.
They've always been here,
Yeah.
so they didn't accept the scientific story about the crossing of the Bering Strait. And then, of course, you had these politically correct scientists who are saying, there's two different ways of knowing, indigenous ways of knowing and other ways of knowing. Here, I think, is one of the prime examples where, like, the level of performative virtue signaling as opposed to real belief is just is really, really great. So I don't really think that these people actually believe. I mean, no, I'm not talking about the indigenous people themselves, but the people who profess that, there are different valid ways of knowing, they don't really buy that. I mean, actually, Steje Hofhuis, we collaborated on some papers on witchcraft in early modern Europe, and we often have discussions, especially Steje, because he's the real historian, with colleagues who were from a postmodernist, social constructivist bent about how could you say that witches didn't exist in early modern Europe, because you're imposing your modern way of knowing or your scientific narrative on these communities, and within these socially constructed environments, witches really did exist. I think these people, I mean, we're talking about women that are flying on broomsticks and kissing the anus of the devil. I don't even think that, nobody is as crazy. An educated, sophisticated social constructivist, he doesn't really believe that stuff. He just professes to believe it for politically correct reasons. And especially when it comes to indigenous people, there's this very strong urge to just signal that you believe that there are different ways of knowing. But when push comes to shove, these people still get vaccination for their kids. They're not going to go to the shaman or the spirit doctor to get cured from disease. Richard Dawkins once said, like, show me a social constructivist at 30,000 feet in an airplane and I show you a hypocrite, or something to that effect. It's like nobody's really deep down a social constructivist, and I think most educated people believe that there's only really one way of knowing, but they just profess differently.
So you don't think there's an element from, say, postmodernism of competing ways of understanding things that there's no resolution possible? Some people say that this viewpoint is not performative, but it really comes from postmodern philosophy. So.
I think if you discuss it in the abstract, I think people can be sincere, like, oh no, but I believe that this, like, every era has its is that hegemony in England? Yeah. I don't even know how to pronounce that word. So it's structure of power and knowledge, like, it's very much influenced by Michel Foucault. And if you think about it in abstract terms, it seems to make sense. But as soon as you make it very concrete, as in the case of that's why I don't like to talk about witches in the abstract, but like people who were flying on broomsticks and who were gathering at night to kiss the anus of the devil. I think as soon as you just get down to earth, that most people will just turn around and immediately lose their any kind of relativist belief that they have, because deep down I think nobody is really a postmodernist.
Yeah, and it's damaging to our understanding too. Well, one of the examples I give in the paper, it's not just innocuous or stupid like witches are, it's injurious, and that is, for example, that if you find a bone in the Western United States, a human bone, human remains, you cannot study it anymore. It has to be handed over to whatever indigenous group claims that this is theirs. Now, they don't have to prove that this is, for example, a Navajo bone or a Cherokee bone, which you maybe could do with DNA. They just have to say that this looks like it belongs to us. All of a sudden, scientists can't study it. So even the mid-history of humans has been impeded this way. I just like to use one quote because it's one of my favorite quotes. It comes from a preacher who gave up religion because he was sick of people telling him that religion was a different way of knowing from science. And he said, there are not different ways of knowing. There's knowing and there's not knowing, and that's all there is. So, and I think the knowing part is science construed broadly, empirically based investigation. So.
Well, going back to the medicines, I think there's two issues there. If you're going to argue that all systems of medicine are equivalent and should be equally respected, the issue is, do they work? And that's about proof, it's about evidence, and as you said, that boils down to clinical trials, actually. So that's not a question of imposing Western hegemony of thought on indigenous people. It's just, does it work? But give me proof that it works. The second issue with indigenous medicines is the exploitation of those medicines by Westerners going to indigenous peoples and then collecting their medical plants and then making a lot of money out of a new drug. So there are two issues there that should be kept apart.
Yeah, in terms of whether it works or not, the National Institutes of Health does have an Institute for Alternative Medicine, and they've invested millions of dollars in all kinds of therapies, magnetic therapy, even coffee enemas, which is something that I would like to avoid. And
yes, rightly so.
As far as I know, not a single alternative procedure has ever proved effective. And they test these double-blind the same way other medicines have. So there's not much evidence that any of these alternative therapies, some of which are derived from indigenous cultures, actually do anything.
No, and then it's not just indigenous cultures, but in Europe you have these nonsensical homeopathic remedies which have nothing in them except water, and Bach flower remedies which are hugely popular in many European countries.
If anything, homeopathy is much more outlandish and absurd than any kind of indigenous knowledge, because at least
there's nothing in it.
Indigenous knowledge at least mostly contains something, some active chemicals.
How do we eliminate homeopathy? I mean, you're not going to convince somebody that uses it that it doesn't work, because it's a form of faith, like religion. So,
yes. Yeah.
But people are wasting millions of dollars on useless nostrums. Yeah.
But I think, of course, I understand the urge to say, because of course, I mean, whether you like it or not, modern science has been mostly invented by white males in 17th and 18th century Europe, and perhaps we would have wished that that was different. And even though, of course, there are precursors in India, in China, in Baghdad, and in the Golden Age, etc. But okay, this is just an accident of history. I think it could have happened elsewhere. It would be nice if we could sometimes point to some non-Western influences on science. And at this point, of course, Western science, the term itself, the adjective, is totally inappropriate because it's globalized and people from all kinds of cultures are participating. But if you want to honor indigenous cultures, I think medicine is not really where you should be looking for, because it's extremely hard for just a human brain to just figure out the statistics and to really tell apart without having controlled double-blind trials, etc. But for example, technologies for building a canoe, for example, or an igloo, or even there's certain detoxification procedures that are used by indigenous cultures.
And don't forget culture and music.
Sorry?
Don't forget culture, music.
Sure, but I'm mostly thinking about knowledge now. So there are certain forms of knowledge that even scientists had a hard time reconstructing after the fact, because I mean, many times the indigenous peoples, of course, didn't have any deep understanding of the underlying causal mechanisms. But there's a very nice book by Joe Henrik, or actually two of them, The Secret of Our Success, where he's actually making the argument that cultural evolution, so not biological evolution, produces artifacts of design that are extremely smart, but that are distributed over many different designers, and that the people themselves can no longer explain. They're just, why do you do this? Why do you build the igloo in that particular way, in that shape, this procedure, according to these steps? They don't really know, but we can, like with the help of modern science, we can understand the underlying scientific principles, but sometimes we can also appreciate and admire just the dexterity, or just an arrow and bow, for example, or just different ways of producing toxins that are used to hunt animals. So I think there is a lot of indigenous knowledge that is actually pretty impressive. But when it comes to medicine, actually everything before, almost everything, there are some exceptions, everything before the 17th century in Europe, as well as all across the world, was basically nonsense. It was basically, you better serve not going to the doctor at all, because most of it is actually harmful.
And that's in fact one of the most important advantages of homeopathy.
Yeah,
at the time,
that it's
because
harmless.
it was completely harmless.
Exactly.
Yeah.
At least you're not
Shall
doing
we?
bloodletting.
I think we can wrap it up, Mike, Jerry, Maarten. What do you think?
Yeah, we've probably been running
I think
for.
we've been Good. Then I would like to thank you, Mike, for participating in the discussion.
Pleasure.
And Maarten for participating in the discussion as well. And Jerry, I'm very glad to have you here on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. If there are any questions, I suggest primarily that you post questions on your website, Jerry.
But I would also urge people to read the paper. Just look up Coyne and Moroja or Skeptical Inquirer.
It's very easy to find,
yeah,
yes.
And then when you read that, then you'll have more questions, I think. So.
Okay. Well, my name is Gert-Jan van het Land. I thank you again. Goodbye.